Feldman Barrett, APS past president, and it's my honor to introduce this presentation by Thomas E. Joyner in recognition of his 2020 APS James McKeen Cattell Fellow Award. The James McKeen Cattell Fellow Award is APS's highest honor, recognizing members for a lifetime of outstanding contribution to the area of applied psychological research addressing a critical problem in society at large. Thomas is the Robert O. Lawton Distinguished Professor in the Department of Psychology at Florida State University. He's known for developing the interpersonal theory of suicide, and he studies the nature, causes, and management of suicidal behavior and related disorders. Congratulations, Thomas, on behalf of myself and the entire APS Board of Directors.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for that introduction. As noted, my name is Thomas Joyner. I'm at Florida State University, and I'll be talking today about the interpersonal theory of suicide. Incidentally, my email address is on the title slide, and I'll remind you of it if you have any follow-up. Quick mention to the U.S. Department of Defense, which has funded my research on suicide now for the last 13 years. Any interest in follow-up on our work can be done at this email address on the screen. With regard to my collaborators and students over the years, I'll acknowledge many of them as I go through some of our work. In a series of papers, all in Psychological Review, starting with this one in 2010, we introduced the interpersonal theory of suicide. In this paper, we articulated its principles, its core concepts. A few years later, 2016, also in Psychological Review, we extended the theory, now using a evolutionary biology frame. And this year, again in Psychological Review, my colleagues and I have integrated the interpersonal theory with work on automatic cognition and implicit cognition. So I want to next introduce you to some of the principles and concepts of the theory itself. The theory divides the main processes into two higher order concepts, one having to do with desire for suicide, the question being who would want to die by suicide in the first place. The other process having to do with capability. How can people enact suicide once the desire develops? With regard to desire, three psychological states are key. Perceived burdensomeness, which is the idea that one's death will be worth more than one's life to loved ones, to family, to friends, to everyone, including oneself. It's key to emphasize that that's a perception. The claim of the theory is not that suicidal people are a burden, rather is that they feel a burden, and then that feeling is driving their risk. A second key psychological state involved in desire for suicide is thwarted belongingness. This is the feeling of being hopelessly cut off. And speaking of hopelessness, that's the third psychological state. It's not just that one feels a burden, which is painful, but it's further that one feels alienated, also painful, and then one feels that these two states are intractable, they're hopeless, the most painful state still. Those three psychological states crystallize, according to this theory, into desire for suicide. But a key insight of the model is that even for desperately suicidal people who truly do desire their death, even for them, it's difficult to actually enact suicide. It's a very fearsome, daunting, potentially painful thing to do, and many people get stopped in their tracks by the fear of it, even those who desperately desire it. Which brings us to the process of capability. How is it that people can enact this very fearsome and difficult act? The model's answer to that question is that capability is key, and it's driven by facets having to do with fearlessness of death, physical injury, physicality in general. Fearlessness is a key part of it. Pain tolerance, physical pain tolerance, also important. And then pragmatics, the knowledge of dosages that'll be fatal, or the knowledge of how to operate a weapon if the method in question is firearm. That's what's meant by pragmatics. And when these two higher order processes of desire and capability come together in the same mind, the same person, that's when we see serious attempts, near lethal attempts at suicide or death by suicide itself. One memory trick to remember these concepts is the ABC mnemonic: A for alone, B for burdensome, and C for capable. This is helpful in clinical teaching when people need to remember the ideas on the fly under pressure. The one disadvantage of this memory trick is that it leaves out hopelessness, which is also a pretty key, important construct. The evidence base for this theory is pretty extensive now. About 200 studies have scrutinized the theory. In this meta-analysis, and here as in other references I've shown, you can see my co-authors and students and collaborators over the years. This paper showed that there's good support for the theory. It's not perfect, but favorable, as one might expect with a relatively young theory that's still in development, still being tested. There are refutations or studies that can at least be viewed as such. This is one done by my former student, Jess Ribeiro, and her current students along with me. This was a paper on predicting future suicidal behavior over the course of days and weeks. And the predictive power of the theory in this study, anyway, was not particularly good. There has been an understandable yearning in clinical circles for prediction. I'm a clinician myself. In addition to being a scientist and scholar, clinical work's an important part of the professional life. And I know for sure that the knowledge of who will die, when they will die, how they will die, would be very reassuring to know, not to mention life-saving for hundreds of thousands of people. And yet prediction is just not where the state of the art is in our science. Moreover, there's no need for high predictive power in order to achieve significant explanatory reach. In fact, that's the status quo in a number of research areas having to do with health. Heart attacks, for instance. We don't know very much really about the who, when, and even the details of how with heart attacks. Strokes is another example, a couple of other examples on the slide. Nevertheless, we understand a lot about these conditions, and we know what to do to improve them. The Challenger disaster in the 80s is another interesting and informative example of this principle. This is about the U.S. Space Shuttle program in the 80s. Early on, a theory emerged about possible disaster. The theory in a nutshell was that at low launch temperatures, an important seal, it's called an O-ring, some of you may remember, would freeze up. And if it freezes up, it can't do its job, which is essentially to keep fuel from contacting flame. If that happens, needless to say, disaster ensues, mid-air explosion. This theory developed early on in the shuttle program, and yet the 10th launch, approximately by then the theory had been developed. 10th launch was fine, refutation of the theory. No prediction there of disaster coming through. 11th, fine. 12th, same. 13th, etc., etc., etc. By the 20th launch, if people were focused only on prediction, this theory should have been abandoned, but then on the 25th, it was prescient of disaster. The shuttle did explode in midair, and the theory of burn through on the O-ring seals is exactly what happened. I think the interpersonal theory can be viewed similarly in that the predictive power, currently not good, though we're working on it. The explanatory reach is significant. And here are 4 examples of the interpersonal theory's explanatory power with regard to phenomena that may seem surprising or antecedently improbable, but that are true empirical facts that happen to accord quite well with the principles of the interpersonal theory. For instance, it's not uncommon for people to plan their suicides, go through that plan, get to the very last step, and then at the last instant experience considerable change of heart, change of mind, regret, and fear. There are even people who have managed to survive a jump from the Golden Gate Bridge in the Bay Area That jump takes 4 seconds. There are people who've happened to survive that jump who later reported that they were determined, full of will, with no fear. And that was true on the railing. That was true when they jumped. And that was true even a second into the jump. But then 2 seconds into the jump, everything changed. Regret flooded over them. Fear flooded over them. That's a hard to understand process unless you factor in the role of fear and fearlessness in serious suicidal behavior. A totally different example is in preschool children. I've done some recent research on this in collaboration with child psychiatrist Joan Luby and also Laura Hennefield, psychologist at WashU in St. Louis. Not only can preschool children get suicidal, not only can it be very serious when they do, not only that, but they also have, this work shows, a firm command of the concept of death itself. They understand what death is. They understand, for example, its permanence. In a group of 228 preschool children, all with major depressive disorder, some with suicidal thinking, some not, we showed that the suicidal kids were far more likely than the other kids to resolve ambiguous stories, which we started. The researchers started the stories and the kids finished the story, resolved the story. They were much more likely to resolve those stories with conclusions and finishes having to do with violence and suicide and the like, really consistent with the interpersonal theories, focus on fear and fearlessness and the things that feed us, like violence exposure. Another example, many may think that most or many suicide decedents were intoxicated by, for example, alcohol at the time of death. And yet the interpersonal theory would make the totally opposite prediction. Alcohol, intoxication from other drugs, is incapacitating. And yet the theory predicts capacity to do hard things is central. And sure enough, the empirical finding accords with the interpersonal theory. The modal suicide decedent had not only low alcohol levels at death, but 0.0% readings. Last, the fact is that with regard to ethnicity, there are two groups that are very vulnerable compared to others to death by suicide in the United States: Native American people and individuals who are white. And those two groups have been shown to also have the highest fearlessness about death as compared to all other groups. Again, very consistent with the principles of the theory. Turning to current times, there's evidence that under the pandemic, risk for things like depression and anxiety have considerably surged. 2 to 3 times the rate would be a fair estimate in terms of risk factors for suicide. And yet, there's some evidence at least that suicide rates did not follow suit, despite the spikes in depression and anxiety, suggesting there's protection, something about the pandemic, despite all of its woe and illness and death, there's something about it that may serve as a protective factor from depression and anxiety converting into suicide death. 2 candidates, people pull together under challenge, crisis, they rally together, and when they do, belongingness rates go up and suicide rates are driven down, consistent with the principles of the theory. A pandemic also has the potential to renew the fear of death or encourage us to embrace health and life. These things are going to drive up the fear of death, and when the fear of death goes up, suicide rates should go down. And again, there is some evidence, surprisingly perhaps, that suicide rates have dropped during the pandemic. I want to close by saying how honored I am to join the ranks of people who have won this award. It's a deep honor, and I'm very grateful. And last, I'll remind you of my email address. It's here on the slide. Feel free to contact me with any questions, suggestions, and the like. Thank you.